It's on. Welcome to Saturday at the Nantucket Book Festival. We have returned to live. Thank you. And it is an honor and pleasure to have you with us this morning. My name is Maureen Fennessy-Bausa. I am lucky to be a board member of the Nantucket Book Foundation that puts together this book festival, and we are now in our 10th year. So, who knew? We couldn't have done it without our committed supporters. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your support. And thank you for your enthusiasm for the written word. Our outstanding supporters continue to help us attract outstanding authors to our small, faraway island. This morning, we are honored to have the award-winning author, Mitchell S. Jackson, with us. His work spans fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and documentary film. I'm not sure there's anything he can't do, but that we can leave to discussion later. His accolades and honors are many. Here's like a brief highlights. Winner of the 2021 Pulitzer Prize in Feature Writing for his essay entitled 12 Minutes and a Life. He's the recipient of the Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence and the Whiting Writers Award. He's been awarded fellowships across a wide range of foundations, from the Lannan Foundation to the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. In addition to that, Professor Jackson holds degrees from Portland State, BA and MA, NYU, MA, and has taught at NYU and the University of Chicago. He is currently the John O. Whiteman Dean's Distinguished Professor in the Department of English at Arizona State University. Today, Mitchell Jackson will be in conversation with our amazing co-founder and president of the Nantucket Book Foundation, Mary Haft. Another high-powered person on this dais. Mary is a writer, a producer, and founder of Haft Productions, specializing in documentaries for nonprofits. She is the author of Nantucket, Portrait of an American Town, and she also serves as vice president of the Penn Faulkner Foundation. Mary has led our Book Foundation's efforts to create and deliver impactful programming on island schools through our Visiting Authors program. So if you've read The Inky Mirror and you've seen these amazing authors coming into local schools, thank Mary. During that pandemic, if any of you viewed the Book Foundation's At Home with Authors video series, which was spearheaded by Michael Schulder, one of our board members right here, you may have noticed and been struck by a 2020 recording of a riveting conversation between our two speakers today, Mitchell and Mary. Their discussion focused on Mitchell's book, Survival Math, Notes on an All-American Family. This work grabs you. I'm going off script. This work was really amazing. It grabs you, it shakes you up, and it makes you think. And isn't that what we want from books? Yay, Mitchell. It's not surprising that that book was widely regarded as best book of 2019 by 15 publications, including NPR, Time, and the Paris Review. I mean, can you get better than that? Here today we have the chance to witness this conversation live. And their energy is amazing. And I bet they're going to share some very potent observations on the human condition through this talk. So please welcome Mary Haft, Mitchell Jackson. Hooray. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. If all of us could just have Maureen in our life and help us introduce every aspect of it, our lives would be richer, better, and more energized. Really, thank you for that great introduction. And yes, as she's referenced, I'm really happy to welcome Mitchell Jackson to our Nantucket Book Festival. We met so many years ago at Penn Faulkner, and Penn Faulkner had recognized him as a voice to pay attention to. His was a voice that mattered, and it was with the very first book, The Residue Years. And I look at this life, which we will get into, and I think Mitchell has used words to shape his life. He's crafted a world from words. How did you find your way into this life as a writer?
I think, first of all, thank y'all for coming. It's early. You don't want to be the first one on the book festival schedule, so I appreciate y'all. When I started, I didn't know anything about a writer's life. I grew up in, well, you guys don't know, I grew up in Portland, Oregon, which has Powell's books, right, and a very rich literary community, which I was completely divorced from growing up. The first time I stepped foot in Powell's, and this will give you an example of how I kind of forged this, was to see Walter Mosley, Devil in the Blue Dress was his big book. Anyway, it was like a Denzel Washington movie. Anyway, so he had like 15 books, and I was 20-something years old, about to go to graduate school at NYU, and I walked up to him, and I was like, Mr. Mosley, like, I am by a book, which is bad. I was in the line. I walked up to him, and I was like, Mr. Mosley, like, I'm about to be a graduate student at NYU, man, and I was just hoping, like, maybe we could stay in contact. And he was like, that's nice, son. Like, you got a book to sign? Well, I don't got a book to sign. And so it was like Will, right? And then I saw him 10 years later in New York, and I was at a book festival, actually, the National Black Writers Conference, and I was in a room, and it was him and who was it? Ernest Gaines, and like really big writers. And I looked up, and I was like, Mr. Mosley, you don't remember me, but like 10 years ago, I told you I was coming to New York to be a writer, wow. and I'm gonna be a writer. I still hadn't published my book though. He was like, that's nice, son. Then about 5 years later, I saw him at the Harlem Book Fair. He was just walking down the street, and I pulled him over, and I was like, Mr. Mosley, you don't remember me, but I met you in 2001, in 2011, and man, I got a book now. And he's like, oh, give me your book, son. I'll buy your book. And we took a picture, and I was like, that's it. 3 markers, third time's a charm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, there's a story that I remember you talked about, and we really do need to go back to a childhood because this is a remarkable life. That Mitchell Jackson sits here as our author today is really a miracle and a testimony to spirit, to spunk, to brains, to wit, to intelligence, and an enormous heart and soul. And so we'll get into the childhood, but there was a great story you told me about in a class. It was writing the first sentence.
Oh, yeah.
What mattered about that?
I think that's a really important, it was a lesson for me. I was in this workshop with an editor named Gordon Lish, who I hope is still alive somewhere being funky with somebody. The way that he teaches his classes is he'll talk for 8 hours, literally, and then he'll tell you, like, all right, y'all go home, use what I told you, and write a sentence. You come back and say, okay, look, I want everybody to read this sentence. If the sentence is good, you can read 2. If I don't like your first sentence, you can't read anymore. And so everyone goes around and reads their sentences, and he stops people in the middle of a sentence. That's not writing. What are you doing? I'm going to die. And I read, she told me to hold it for safekeep. And he was like, yeah, okay, go ahead, Jackson. I was like, oh, man, one sentence? You would not believe how happy I was about a single sentence. And then the next sentence, I said, she told me to hold it. No, I got 2 off. She told me to hold it, and then she took it back. He said, yes, go on. Now I got 2 sentences in. I'm feeling really good about myself. And the third sentence, which is to me the great lesson, I said, rent money from under the mattress. And he said, stop, Jackson. He said, don't you ever ask for anyone's sympathy on the page. And I think that not only was that a lesson about the page, like I think so many writers that have a, quote, hard knock life or disadvantage, like that is their currency, and they wield that in the world. I think there's a couple of problems with that. One is there's always a person with a worse story, so then your currency becomes less. Like, you know, inflation hits you and now your dollar is worth 20 cents because the next person came along with a greater sob story. But I also feel like that's a lesson for people and their benevolence and their kindness and people who are in power not to be looking at people as victimized, right? Like, disadvantage, yes, and I think it's a way of interacting with people, right? Not like seeing them as your charity, but like human beings that might need some assistance in the way that we've all, at some point, needed assistance. And that one sentence really, really taught me a lesson about that.
Well, it is a lesson that he took and then continued to string sentences together to create a story that became his first fictional novel called The Residue Years. The Residue Years is really a thinly veiled kind of autobiography. It has elements that literally can break your heart. They take you as the best words in the world can do. His book allows you to enter a world that you may have never known. It allows you to understand, and when we talk about disadvantaged, you talk about communities on the edge, communities on the margins. Our situations today, when we talk about the racial inequities and the systemic issues that bring us to a place, there are reasons that Mitchell Jackson's childhood was the childhood that it was. Mitchell, tell us a little bit so we can understand in the audience, you can bring us with you a bit about that childhood.
Well, I think when I hear about people being on the margins, I think it's really important to talk about the agents, right? Like, you don't just end up on the margins, you get pushed to the margins. And so to me, interrogating those forces that push people to the margins is really like my life's work. And, you know, I could tell you about my disadvantages, you know, mother that was addicted and going to prison and all of that. I mean, that's not really a remarkable story, though, to be honest with you. Like, there's 100 guys I can name from my neighborhood, from my era, that have the same story or a worse story, that did 15, 20, 17 years, you know, lost more people than me. So I feel almost ashamed to mention that I went to prison because it was so short, right? Like, I get in a room with my friends who did real numbers, you know, calendars and calendars and calendars in prison. And to me, the fact that they're still out in the world and able to laugh and hug and touch their grandkids or their children, to me, that's like remarkable resilience. I think if there's a thing that I have figured out about myself and my experience is that, one, don't make that your own currency. So like, I've never written about prison. You know, there are plenty of people to do it. There are more people that have much more authority than me, you know, to write about that, but that's not my thing. My thing is like, I want to sing. I want to get on the page and I want to sing. And I'm singing an experience, of course, and, you know, it takes intelligence to sing, right? It's not just like I'm not up there, not that spoken word is not intelligence. But I'm saying it's not just me up there putting a note with a note, like there is forethought and there's research and all of that, but I think a lot of serious writers, their first mission is to show you their intelligence, is to reveal their intelligence. And my first mission is to sing. And then I want to show you something. And I think it's like a way of seeing the world, right? It's like a creativity is leading versus politics or even my story.
Well, I would say your voice does sing. It's a really singular voice on the written page, on the page. It's a singular voice. It's dexterous, it's quick, it's sharp, it's funny. You know, sometimes, I remember saying to you once, like, I laughed out loud, but it is really, ultimately, it's your extraordinary intelligence that is looking so deeply into lives, situations. And from the residue years, that did bring you to the next book, which is nonfiction, called Survival Math. And that is the book, actually, that I think you found we're celebrating this day. It's his most recent book. Survival Math is really the calculus of survival. And it becomes, as you get into this, you can almost have algebraic rhythms. It gets complicated, those calculations. Yeah. And then really remarkably, and I remember talking to you in New York, that must have been our night, we talked till like 2 a.m, and how hard that is, because what he did is went in deep into his own family, into his own community, used the people in his world that he understood and knew. That takes real courage too. So talk to us about survival math.
Well, the shorthand for survival math is being put in situations, or really it came out of a particular situation where I thought my life was threatened. No, it was threatened. I didn't think it was threatened. It was. And coming out on the other side of it. So I had a guy who approached me who we had, well, I didn't have a problem with him, but there was conflict. And he pulled a gun on me. And in the moment between, he was like, "Do you want to die?" And me making all of these considerations, like, can I get to my gun, which is in the car? It was 5 a.m, so there was no witnesses outside, all of these calculations. And of course I didn't want to die. But I did that math, and then I responded in a way that saved me in that moment. And I was really, obviously, relieved at that. And then years later, I started to think about, when I was crafting survival math, like, how many of my community members, how many of my family members had been not necessarily in that same situation, but had to use that calculus to make a decision that may or may not have some bearing on whether or not they actually lived. And then broader, like, I think, if we think about this last, 5 years, like, we've been in a national calculus of survival math, right? Like, we're still doing, like, we talking about voting rights and women's reproductive rights, and, that's survival math, right? So I think you can expand. That's another thing that I really have, like, come to admire, is the ability to see the macro and the micro, to, like, take my kind of small community as a microcosm for things that are happening elsewhere. And I also think that we're not really that complicated. I was at Oberlin College once, and the ex-president of Oberlin College is a guy named Robert Fuller. I don't know, Dr. Robert Fuller. And he wrote a book called Somebodies and Nobodies. And his basic premise was that you can boil down basically any inequality to the dichotomy between a somebody and a nobody. Between a man and a woman, a black person and a white person, between a recent immigrant and a long ago immigrant. And so I think if you think about that idea of somebody and nobodies, right, between rich and poor, right? Like, it's not really that hard to figure out, like, people's kind of basic motivations for doing things. And we keep finding other evidence, right? Like, you can go to Australia, right? I remember going to Australia, which is damn near as far as you can get away from here, right? But the natives were in prison. I went to visit a prison, right? The poor people were in prison, right? The other people were still living well. So, like, it's not really that hard. Even though I do think it's worthwhile to keep finding these examples of essentially human nature, or human nature at large.
Well, I think when we look at the gifts that clearly you have been manifest with, the gift now is that you have added to your literary career, and you've turned your face toward these important critical issues of social justice, and you began to do feature writing.
Yeah.
And of course, this is a really funny story. I'm picking Mitchell up at the ferry. I'm on the docks. Actually, I have a great video of, I had a whole class of children that were finishing a field trip, so I had them standing, waving as the boat was pulling in. But anyway, he's coming down off the ramp, and I'm, Mitchell Jackson. And of course, the guy next to me waiting too is kind of laughing, like, oh, like, how embarrassing is that for poor Mitchell, like Mitchell Jackson? And I was like, Mitchell Jackson, our Pulitzer Prize winning author.
You want to get embarrassed, just hang out with Mary.
You know,
You need-
I think it matters to celebrate. You know, I've had a lot in my life, and what I say is, you know what? Celebrate the celebrations. Love who you love. Tell them. So I did it. Actually, broadcast at the ferry.
Yeah.
I love you, and I celebrate you. Okay. Anyway, so you won
Yeah.
the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
How did you find yourself turning to feature writing?
Well, I had turned to it a long time ago when I moved to New York, and I was a struggling part-time professor and working on that book that I was trying to show Mr. Mosley for a decade. I wrote a lot in hip-hop journalism, which no one cares about, right? But I wrote stuff for Vibe and this magazine called The Source and Essence and all the black magazines, right? Nobody cares. You never see a Pulitzer winner coming out of Essence or Vibe, any of those books, which is also something about inequality, right? So I did that, and then I stopped when I published my first novel. I was like, I am now a serious writer. I can no longer be writing for these publications. And but when you publish a novel, inevitably they're going to ask you to publish short pieces. If you publish a book, they're going to ask you to publish. So then I was publishing excerpts or essays, and it kind of got me back in the spirit of writing short pieces or creative nonfiction. And I was also teaching it, so it helped that I was actually engaging in the thing that I was teaching in. And that particular story, I was working in fiction. I was working on the novel that is years and years and years from being done. But I had finished enough of it, I thought, to get a book deal. And so I had given it to my agent. I was just sitting around one day, and an editor that I had worked with on another story, which probably no one else cares about, but I did because it was a feature on Michael B. Jordan. And the reason I did it was because Michael B. Jordan was playing Bryan Stevenson, who I hope you all have read and watched his TED Talk. He's an amazing human being. And so I thought, oh, I'll get to meet Bryan Stevenson if I do this story on Michael B. Jordan. Don't tell Michael B. Jordan that. And I did get to meet both of them. But that editor, we had a really great working relationship. And so he kept asking me to do things, and I was like, no, no, no. And then I finished that submission from my agent, and he called and said, I have a story for you. Are you interested in writing a story on Ahmaud Arbery? And remember, we're in a pandemic. I was like, do I have to travel? And he said, no. And normally, I would not take that kind of story because I feel like the least capable of making a kind of on-the-spot assessment of what has happened. So this was, it was months after he had been killed, but it was just a few weeks after they had actually released the footage. And so I was like, I don't want to be the guy going on CNN the next day after something happens, giving you, I'm not Charles Blow. Thank God for Charles Blows, right? But I wanted to digest it. And so the feature gave me an opportunity to digest it. And they had one contact for me. It was his coach. And I called his coach. Hey, I'm Mitchell. And, we chatted for a minute. And he had somebody in the car with him that just kept chiming in. And I'm like, well, who is this dude? And that dude turned out to be Ahmaud Arbery's best friend. And so that's really how the reporting worked on that story, was me talking to a friend who would mention a story, and then I would say, oh, I don't know, Jasmine. Do you mind introducing? Oh, sure, I'll introduce you. And what I learned over the course of reporting that story, which took about 2 weeks to do the reporting, was how generous Arbery's community was, his family, his friends, and how much light he had left in the world. And then I didn't talk to his mother. That was one of the key people that I didn't interview. I was like, I'm not bothering this woman about her son. But I did talk to her later. And one of the first things I told her was like how great of a job you'd done that you had raised these kids that had so much light in them. And so, yeah, that was a really, really, and obviously you're not thinking about the Pulitzer Prize when you're working on that. It's an impossibility. So it was really just to honor him. And there was a thing that was really special to me. I had just finished rereading Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, which if you have not read it, I think it's her best book. And if you have read it, then reread it. But there's a moment towards the end of that book, I hope I'm not spoiling it for you, where one of the characters is at the funeral of her granddaughter. And she's walking down the aisle and she's singing. And then she gets to the casket and she says, "And she was loved." And I remember thinking about that line. And if you ever read this Aubrey piece, there's a kind of long litany of details about Ahmad. And at the end of it, I say, "And he was loved." And when I wrote it, I heard it in my head, just like I heard Toni Morrison saying it. And to me, that was like, all of the stuff that I wrote was really to get to that moment, right? When we lose one of these young people, usually often a young person, not always, it's like, no, they were loved. Like, yeah, something bad happened to them, and yeah, they might have did this or did that, and we can talk about ballistics and all, but the reality of it is that they were loved by someone. Who in this world is not loved by a single person? And so to me, to be able to get to that moment and for you to feel that this young man was loved, whatever else you thought about the case, he was a loved human being. To me, that was like the crux of what I did in that piece.
Well, it was shining testimony to a young life that was snuffed out. Yeah. And then I wonder, because you go so deep, and that piece resonated with feeling and thought and love most of all. What kind of toll does it take? Because you had to enter deeply the world of this young man and understanding yourself, what you have grown up with, what you lived through.
Yeah.
What toll does it take to enter that?
Has anybody ever read that essay? It was actually a speech I think he gave to Kenyon College, David Foster Wallace. And the speech is called "This is Water." Anybody ever read this? Check it out, it's short. And his premise is like, the fish doesn't know it's water, right? And to me, violence is water. And I well, you know, we can deconstruct why that is, and trauma is water. You know, like on any given day, I can pick up a Portland newspaper and see an Arbery-like story repeated. And which is not to say that I'm apathetic to it. I just understand it in a different way. And I've done enough mourning, and I've done enough soul searching, and being really critical of it. Because when you're in it too, like when you're in the water and you don't notice it, like when I was growing up, it was just, you know, the milieu. But now it's like, oh, I can get up a rung higher to be able to look and say, oh, here's how we got to this area. I remember doing when my first book came out, I somehow ended up at a meeting with our mayor. And it was not the mayor, it was a community meeting with the mayor, the police chief, and some community leaders. And they were talking about, they showed the police blotter for the week. And in the neighborhood where I grew up, which is called Northeast Portland, it had been gentrified, right? So they were like, oh, Northeast Portland, like, there's basically no crime in Northeast Portland. And I was like, wow, that's strange. Like, the people that I had grown up with had been moved out 100 and something blocks to what we now call the numbers. And in the numbers, it was like shooting, robbery, stabbing. And I was like, wow, they literally just moved the crime to another area. Like, they literally stopped it where they wanted to stop it, because in Northeast now the home prices is nice. Everybody got lawns that are cut, and you know, it's beautiful. And I was like, it was like a aha moment, like, oh, this is politics, right? This is business. This isn't, I mean, yeah, this is crime, but no, this is politics and business and home ownership and home values and taxes, and all my people out there still having the same struggles.
You know, I just listened to you, and I think that is, you know, we are living in a systemically divided world today, and that is part of the issue, is keep pushing those people that are already on these margins, keep pushing them. Yeah. And so what is, was the Aubrey piece your most challenging, or what is the most challenging piece you
Oh,
had to jump
no.
into?
The most challenging thing I wrote was in survival math. It was an essay about my relationship to women. And I wrote that essay. There was another version of it, but I wrote it, and I remember not finishing it, and I gave it to my editor, and who it was and is a great friend, a great literary champion, one of the most, she's an empath. I mean, all the great things you can say about a human. And she was like, Mitchell, I couldn't finish this.
And I'm just going to say, as a woman, I read this, and it's difficult.
Yeah.
And it's also difficult for me to reconcile this person that I know and love. It's difficult for me to reconcile that.
Yeah.
So explain what you mean.
I mean, just the best way to explain, I mean, just a troubled relationship with women, cheating, harm to women, not physical harm, emotional harm to women. And when she read it, I also was thinking about, you know, because it's one thing to write about yourself if you're a memoirist, right? But then your story becomes other people's story because inevitably you're connecting to these people. And so I was like, oh, I have to be able to, well, I would love to give these women agency in this piece. And so I started calling and texting exes, which I don't advise, you know? Yeah. And I was telling her, like, hey, look, I'm writing this thing. Here's what it's about. I would love for you to talk. And whatever you tell me, I'll just put it in the book. And I got a couple of, you know, real exes that was like, middle finger to you. And then I got a couple of them that were like, okay. And so I would go to their house and I would interview them and record it. In that section, the people that responded are in the book. And so to me, that was kind of the I don't know, it wasn't the best that I could do, but it felt fitting that I would open up a space for them because it wasn't just, I remember going to therapy and my therapist used to always be like, a relationship is never one hand clapping. And so I needed to have the other hand to be able to give them space and not for them to feel like I was trying to ameliorate what I'd done or, you know, paint a different picture. I'm like, oh, you tell it like you want it, and I'm not going to edit this, you know, obviously for typos or something, but like whatever you tell me is what's going in this book. So yeah, that was the most difficult. But I think no matter what you're writing, because I sit usually so long, unless I'm writing a column, I sit with it for so long that it becomes an artifact. It becomes something that I'm now revisioning as a writer. And so I think you have to be able to get to that place because you can't keep writing from a hot spot. Like it might be good to get it down on the page, but that's not really going to help you discern what should go and what shouldn't and what paragraph needs to go on top and what doesn't. And to me, that's the fun part. That is a rewarding part of the writing process is revision. Like I'm not great on a first pass, but if you give me revisions, I can do anything.
Well, revision brings me to redemption. And you know, redemption is something that I think resonates also through your work. And there's enormous, in all of your writing, there's enormous compassion, there's enormous empathy and heart. Talk about redemption in this journey.
You know, I haven't actually framed it for myself in that way. I do think that I'll say the thing, I have to stay connected to where I'm from. And that is oftentimes to my detriment. But I can't get away from that. Like I just had a cousin who came home 2 weeks ago. I already got a job working on a work crew. But I think he did like 9 years. And this guy graduated from high school with me. Like it's my first cousin. Just came home, and we haven't had conversations, but we've been like talking to each other on social media. And I was just thinking, like, he emailed me and he was talking about, we had the same English class together. And he was like, man, remember we were in English class and such? And I was like, no, I didn't remember that. But I'm so glad that you brought that memory up, because now that's something that we can share together and that I remember. So I think because I'm trying to always stay connected to that, I don't want to say world, to my people, that I don't think of redeeming. I think of never, it's a simple thing in writing, never put yourself above the other in your work. And I think we can take that as a lesson in the world, right? Never put yourself above the other in the world. If you can find fault in a critique in another human being, you should be able to turn that same kind of incisiveness and criticism on yourself. And to me, it always levels out, right? Like if you're honest about your own foibles, then it's gonna kind of balance out. And so nobody cares about a Pulitzer in the hood. I don't even know what it is, right? Like literally, I called my mama the day I won a Pulitzer. I was like, Mom, like I just won this award. It's the Pulitzer. And she was like, oh, that's good, baby. Well, what's that?
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, right. Like I could have told her I won the Jack in the Box sweepstakes. She'd have been like, cool, how much money? Yeah, like, no. So it's also like it keeps you level, right? Like no one literally cares that I've done this thing, right? It has no currency there. Now, if I would have done a story on Jay-Z and I would have came home and they'd been like, yo, you talking to Hove? Yeah. Oh my God, man. Yeah, so that also, you know, it's a balance, right? And I think that's important for all of us.
Well, Louise Penny yesterday referenced a quote that I love the most, and I've used it, actually, I think I used it 2 years in a row on my Christmas card. It's Leonard Cohen. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I look at you, Mitchell Jackson, and I think, yes, a life in which there were so many cracks, but look at the light you have let in. And because you turned your world into words, you bring all of us with you. And your reach has actually become global. And it's an extraordinary gift that whatever God created in you, here you are in the world with us, making a life and crafting a life in words. It's remarkable. I think we now need time. We have time for just a few questions.
Mary, just one point that we may not have made clear. James McBride is not going to be with us 11. He has an obligation to his family, which very happily his niece is having a baby. But, so there's nobody in the 11 o'clock slot. So if you want a few questions, we do have time for it.
Oh.
Normally we would have stopped you a little earlier, but we started late, and it was hard to stop you, frankly. And so we wanted to hear more and more from both of you.
Well, more time for questions. Okay.
I wish I had a hat collection like James McBride.
Yeah.
I'm sorry you all are missing his hat collection, but please go online and view his many, many hats.
Okay, well, wait a second. This is like known as one of the most styling writers, and he and Jason Reynolds have a little contest going. And like, honestly, the dispassionate observer over here, I don't know, I think you're running neck and neck to me. It's pretty good. Okay, time for questions.
I just wanted to, you started talking about survival math and how you got out of a situation where you had a gun. And, but then, unless it's not too personal or whatever, but you said how you got out of the situation because you did survival math. So how did you get out of that situation?
Oh, I mean, that was as simple, like, that she was asking me how did I get out of the situation that I described in the title of Survival Math. He said, hey man, we got a problem. And I looked around and knew that if I answered in one way, yeah, we got a problem, that's it for me. So I was like, nah, man, we don't got a problem. And he was like, yeah, because I'm a real killer. And he got back on his little bike and he rode off. And I think to me, the important thing about that is that that young man, a year later, murdered someone in front of his mama. And then that young man went to prison and murdered his best friend inside of prison. And these were all guys that I went to high school with. I went to high school with that guy. I went to high school with the guy that he murdered. And so when he said I'm a killer, I knew this. And so 10 years later, once you get the advantage of looking back and saying, oh, this guy was telling the truth, that's really what made me think about the efficacy of survival math, right? Like, oh, you better be able to negotiate these conflicts. But again, like, I doubt if somebody gonna pull a pistol on y'all and say, we got a problem. But I do think, we're constantly affecting survival math, right? Like, I was in Saudi Arabia 2 weeks ago, and I was trying to figure out how to say something about that dead journalist. And I figured out a way to say it, but that was actually a survival math calculation. 'Cause I'm like, I say the wrong thing, I'm not coming home. Now, I don't care who brought me out here, they do not care. And so to me, that was a different level of survival math in a wholly different world, right?
I mean, actually, you seriously could go home in a box. Like, we
Right.
saw what happened to that
Or
journalist
not
at
go
the
home in
Post.
a box.
Well,
Just
right,
never-
they cut him up. They cut him up, and like, who
Yeah.
knows where his pieces went. So how did you find a way to say something?
Well, I couched it with narrative. So I was with I was with several scientists. And they were talking about climate change and other kind of what they call world crises, issues. And I said, I've been here a couple days with y'all, and what I haven't heard is anyone talking about narrative. And I said, back in the States, there's a lot of people upset because there's a project that tries to re-narrativize or maybe course correct the idea of America and its founding. I said, and it has gone so far now as we have book bans and people burning books. And I said, I think that, so everybody kept talking about our shared values and our culture, and everybody was saying, I was like, well, culture, values, it's a story. It's a narrative that we tell ourselves, right? Just like we tell ourselves about the founding of America, that possibly is shared culture among some people, and then some people it isn't. And I told them, I was like, we need to protect our storytellers. And I said, even if it means that we're critiquing power. And I said this with the king of Saudi Arabia in the room, and I was like, well, I'm going to make it up out of here. And I'm smiling. I say this. And then when it was over, he came up to me and he said, we love our storytellers in Saudi Arabia. And I was like, yes, sir. Yeah. I love your storytellers too. Yeah.
He kind of loved them to death.
Yeah, exactly. But to be able to say that in that room with 35 Nobel laureates and probably 5 or 6 heads of state, I said a thing that was a true thing. It might have been tempered a little bit, but, I wanted to come home. I wouldn't have made it to the Nantucket Book Festival.
I mean, that's really brave and really, really good. And I feel like everyone should be reading Azar Nafisi's book, Reading Dangerously. Like, it is literally, we are at a time in America where we have got to pay attention. We have got to allow ourselves to be open to all of the diverse views that this country represents. And it's like, unclench your hearts. Keep an open. We've become so divided. Anyway, I see lovely Dylan, who actually was magnificent in helping us a year ago.
She asked me a really good question last night. I hope it's not going to be
I hope it's here
one.
today. And she really is a big piece of, we continue to strive to do better, be better. And lovely Dylan came a year ago and helped us do just that.
Thank you. Mitchell, my question for you is, in your teaching, how much are you learning and what are you learning? And in your writing, how much is your intent to teach and what are you trying to teach?
Oh, that's great. I want to start with the back end of that question because it's almost funny. Another guy that I pressed in the literary world was a guy named Jonathan Galassi, who is now I don't know what he is, the chairman of Farrar, Straus and Giroux. At the time, he was the editor-in-chief of FSG. I was in graduate school. I ran up on him at a conference. In graduate school, no novel finished. I'm like, Mr. Galassi, I'm in graduate school. and I'm gonna have a novel in 3-4 years. Like, will you read it? He looked at me like, son, like, you don't know this ain't how this works? But he gave me his card. And so 3 years later, I emailed Mr. Galassi, hey, Mr. Galassi, I have a novel. So he read a version of Survival Man, of The Residue Years. And he sent me a note back, and he was like, son, this is, you're trying to teach us a lesson here. And, some good stuff in here, but this isn't it. And that really turned me away from, like, not trying to teach someone a lesson. It took me 5 more years to revise that thing, but I was really happy for that. Now, if you fast forward, the book that I was working on before I was working on the Aubrey piece sold to FSG. When we were closing the deal, Galassi was on the call. And I was like, Mr. Galassi, I don't know if you remember me. But 15 years ago, I ran up on you at AWP. And here we are. Yeah.
I mean, what?
Here's something, right? You got to run up on people.
I mean, what a lesson in persistence, though. I mean, when I'm
decades.
When I'm flagging, I got to remember this.
In terms of my students, I love teaching. I always get more out of it. And really, it's been a great education in the most recent years, probably the last probably 5 years, in gender. I've had some trans students, had many LGBTQ students, and just, going from really having to pay, like, not understanding it to, like, what now it's always give me your pronouns in the beginning of class, right? And then it's the work, right? So I have had the benefit of now teaching 20 years, so I can remember what people were writing about 20 years ago. So I'm actually seeing what you all will be reading in 10 years, 5 years. If we're lucky, maybe some of them next year or the year after. And you will be reading about this, right? Like it's what they're concerned with. And it is a great education for me. And I think it's also a lesson on how to affect change, right? How to change a dialogue. And a lot of it, to me, comes out of the language. There's a big push in Black studies, but no one really cares outside of Black studies to not use the word slave, right? To use the word enslave, which places the agency on the people that were doing the thing to the other people versus, like, you're not just born as a slave, right? And I think that change in language is actually a change in thinking, and that's something that we're learning from that community, is like how the language changes our thinking. And I'm very fortunate that every semester I'm in there. The other thing, though, is it makes me feel old, too, because, like, they're always 18, and then I'm 46. And I'll be 47 next year. I'm going to be 50 years old. They still going to be 18.
It does when you're talking about, I was thinking about, I was in St. Louis probably like 7 years ago. It was really when there was a terrible racial riots and just a city in pain.
Yeah.
And my daughter was in school, and I was with a Somali Uber driver. And as we're driving by these massive protests, and our hearts are out there, and I'm in this great conversation with my wonderful Somali driver, and he kind of shook his head and he said, "We're born to hate." I said, "Oh no, we're not. We are born to love. We learn to hate." And I look at your life and say, you could have come different directions. You were born to love, and you have kept that love intact. And you have brought that humanity, that deep, deep humanity, into every facet of your reporting and your writing. So where do you take it next? What's next on your horizon?
I'm glad you asked about that, because and even that story of you going through St. Louis. So the thing that I'm working on is a novel about a Black man whose organization was, when it ended, considered a cult. See how the language changed? I didn't say he was a cult leader. I said his organization was called a cult when it was over. But interesting that this man grew up in Watts, California, and was a child during the Watts Revolt. The thing that I hadn't been thinking about it prior to that, but when I think about, I'm old enough to remember the L.A. Revolt, right? And so we call it riot, or we can call it revolt. And the reason why I bring that up is because the first line of this new novel is, for some a riot, for others a revolt. And so to me, that change in perspective, right? It's almost like, well, are they on the margins or did they get pushed? Like, who riots with no reason, right? And so then can we call these uprisings or these revolts in these places where the underserved or underprivileged or people pushed out to the margins are angry or are tearing up something that they don't own, right? So to me, it's a vantage, right? It's like, now it's forcing me to look at the way that I would consider any kind of push against power. And I think we saw that over 2020, right? And luckily people who weren't as marginalized got into it, so it became the national, the biggest global protest ever. But when we saw it in 1992, we quick, like, that's a riot. We saw it in Watts, that's a riot. We saw it in Detroit, that's a riot. We saw it in Minneapolis, that's a riot. It's not a riot. It's not a riot. I don't even know if we have riots, because it's always people who are pushed to the margins are the ones who are doing the rioting or whatever we consider rioting. Like, those are people that are, was it, who said that? Dr. King, like, a riot is the language of the silenced or something like that. Like, it's not a riot. And so to me, really being critical about the language that I use to talk to myself and about my experience and about our experience, it's worth all the marbles.
Well, it's really powerful. We probably have time for one. Yeah. We'll take Azar as the last question.
Thank you for a tantalizing conversation.
Yeah.
Last night you were talking about James Baldwin.
Yeah.
About him, and you mentioned the universal aspect of him.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about that all night. The fact that Baldwin was very much an African-American writer, an American writer.
Yeah.
But in the long, the final thing about him is that he was a writer.
Yeah.
And I wondered how you felt about this aspect of your work, the universal aspect.
I think, Baldwin was a humanist, right? Like, he was writing about our experience and all of our experience. And I think so it's inevitable when you're a writer, they're going, like, even when you know this, when your book is coming out and they're trying to sell your book, they're like, what are the comps, right? Like, what other books can we compare this book to? And then when you come out, they're like, well, is this guy writing about this thing, right? So I'm black and I'm writing about my experience. So now I'm writing about race because I'm black, right? You can't just write about your experience and be not a race writer. At least they think that. And so in that way, I understand the ways in which I'm boxed in. But again, I also think that there is valuable insight in that little space. Like, I really only have written about Northeast Portland, not even Portland. Like, you asked me to go to Multnomah Falls, like, I went when I was a kid. They like, hiking? I don't hike. So I don't even know the Oregon that most of you all think is Oregon. I've never seen Portlandia. I'm writing about something this big. But in that, I bet you there's something that speaks to all of you. And so I understand that the world is gonna box me in, and I understand that maybe my vantage is, as big as this room, but I think there's a lot of value in that. Do I think that I'm in a place? I think that Baldwin had a much larger square that he was writing about. And I think also because, Baldwin went to Switzerland and Baldwin went to Paris. Like, you go away, right? Like, he was writing some of that great stuff about America from Paris, right? Stranger in the Village, right? Like, you get away and then you see it differently. And I've spent time outside of the country, obviously, but I've never lived outside of the country. And so I appreciate Baldwin. I don't think we have a Baldwin now. I love Ta-Nehisi. And so no disrespect. Don't be going out there talking about, this dude said something about Ta-Nehisi. We straight. But he's not Baldwin. And I know that they give him like, this is the new James Baldwin. He's not, though. He's not. And also, Baldwin did it in both, right? So, I mean, you know, fiction and nonfiction, I think that's also a gift. And I also feel like fiction pushes you to think about humanity in a way that nonfiction does not require of you. Unless you're doing really great creative nonfiction where you can get into the head of a person, but you also have to ask them. But fiction demands that you are inside of another person, and journalism doesn't do that, right? So I think that also, he came out as a fiction writer, right? So I think that's also really important about Baldwin, that he worked in both of those genres.
That was such a beautifully elegant construct. And literally, you are the most elegant man in your thought, in the way you
Got to
write.
take Mary with you, y'all. I'm telling you. You take Mary with you, you be okay.
Well, really, we did. We started this sort of dance together so many years ago, and we've been kind of dancing in words and thoughts and heart like ever since. And I'm just so incredibly grateful to be able to say Mitchell Jackson is also my friend. So we're so grateful he is with us.
Thank you.
At the Nantucket Book Festival, and we thank all of you for being with us.